Rishi, we're getting a ton of questions, comments, mentions of support for different ways you might be able to engage students, other ways we might be able to get young people involved. Can we talk to student governments? Do you want to talk a little bit more about what your outreach looks like and speak to some of this?
Yeah, so in terms of yeah, that's actually a really wonderful idea in terms of the student government. So we actually tried that at my school and it didn't pass, unfortunately. And we're gonna try again in March or soon. But basically we had this idea to sort of the back from the brink model is built around, local, state, and federal governments. And why can't we extend that principle to student governments? Fortunately, since I go to a private school right now, and there's like, they're incorporated as a nonprofit, so they can't take political stances. So they found some bureaucratic way essentially to not let us do it. But we're gonna try again, but sort of make it more symbolic and less overtly political. But in terms of that specific law, which guarantees the right to assemble, I think that's actually I didn't know about that law, but I think working with schools in New York State to do that would be a really wonderful idea. In terms of how to get young people involved, I think interfacing with educational environments as much as possible, especially through teachers, like professors at universities, and high school teachers and even middle school teachers. The person that sort of nurtured my passion for this the most was my history teacher, who sort of read through my drafts of my paper about the freeze movement and talked to, was willing to sort of have those conversations with me. And I think especially when teachers like discuss the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in history class, allowing sort of discussion to be cultivated around, was that really the right decision? There's oftentimes a narrative crafted in the U.S. That's pushed upon students that was the right call. We saved American lives. That's the end of the discussion. But allowing that room for students to really wonder, is this the right decision? What were the ramifications for today? That we were even willing to do all that. So teachers nurturing that sort of thought in the classroom, and then also providing the opportunities for action, which we started collaborating with several teachers and professors, I think is a great win. And in terms of school history classes, yeah, I think that's a great idea. I probably could zoom into a few of them, but I'm not the only one. There's a bunch of other students and people on board with us. So definitely if you have an idea to follow up on that, please reach out to us. That'd be great. And I think we can get some follow-up info in Emily's email to all the attendees later. But thanks for all the questions.
Great, thanks, Rishi. That's really helpful. The next question is from Joanne Robinson. It has to do with the TPNW signatories and asking why is it that the wealthiest nations refuse to sign the treaty, and it's the Black and Brown nations that are not afraid to support nuclear abolition. I have my theories on this, but wondering what you all think.
Shall I
Larry.
respond to that? Yeah. Basically, nuclear weapons are a means of exerting power. Weapons are, generally speaking. And great powers in the past have looked forward to getting the most devastating, most effective weapons available. So that it's not surprising that the major nations in the Security Council, the Big Five, have developed nuclear weapons fairly quickly as compared to the rest of the world. But other nations followed them, including Israel and India, another rising nation, and Pakistan rivaling India and in conflict with India, and North Korea has been in a state of war or confrontation ever since the Korean War. So the weapons are a means of exerting power, and in a way, it's not surprising that the smaller nations and non-nuclear nations have said, we don't want that sort of thing. We want the big guys, the big powers to get rid of their nuclear weapons. The solution they went for back during the nuclear non-proliferation treaty was that they'd be happy not to develop nuclear weapons if the great powers got rid of theirs. So you would have equality on that basis. But there are powers that don't want equality. They like being the big gun on the block, and unfortunately, they're just the ones who are not willing to put it down.
Thank you, Larry. David, Diane, Rishi, anyone else want to weigh in on this?
Well, I would just briefly add that, you know, any kind of privilege that's held, you know, those with great privilege will hang on to it with any means they can. And of course it's absurd because we all go if the weapons are used, but they can be held over people's heads. So the question is how long that can be maintained. And I think the less powerful countries that Joanne refers to are taking a stand that can make a difference. And I think we need to be focusing on the logic there, that no one can survive with these weapons.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I agree that the smaller states can play a role, the middle powers, as they're called in the UN framework, and in the various other policy issues and human rights and other kinds of issues at the UN, and also even the very beginning of the process for the TPNW came out of the middle power states. And the more they can organize and increase their number, and then have processes to keep the issue on the agenda, it can gradually, I think, have an influence. And that's, I think, what's the strategy for pushing the TPNW at the international level.
I guess I would also just add that in the same way that the less powerful nations, as David says, if they work together, can have some influence, I feel that's the case with us in our organizations. You know, and we need to hold on to that and keep working to expand our influence and our reach and the logic behind it.
Great. Thank you, Diane. There's been a few questions and comments in the chat related to nuclear deterrence and what do we say to people who are still very much subscribe to the theory of nuclear deterrence, like Congress member Claudia Tenney, for instance. Who would like to start?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask who would like to start, and Rishi, it's you.
Okay. Yeah, I actually encountered this sort of a lot in terms of not from a very like elevated like international relations like theoretical perspective, but in terms of just like, you know, talking to young people on a daily basis. Like people are scared of our adversaries. I think it's important not to sort of deny the very logic of the or completely deny that, you know, deterrence as a concept you know, worked. For example, you know, we have what I often sort of tell people is like we have laws, right? To prevent people from robbing banks, we have laws that deter them from doing that by saying you will go to jail if you rob a bank. But it doesn't work when, you know, the deterrence is you know, genocidal weapons that can not only, you know, explode on purpose, but accidentally explode, you know, due to people who are not perfectly rational operating them, things like that. There's so many issues with just human beings that get scaled up greatly when we're talking about billions of deaths. You know, people aren't perfect in terms of like knowing what's a threat and what's not. There have been so many close calls throughout history that I'm sure you know, Professor Whitner and Corey can elaborate on that I've read about. But also, you know, we don't elect perfect people who make perfect decisions, as we saw this year, right? That sort of the general concept of deterring someone from doing something works, but I think the rhetoric that's really effective is the risk that comes along with this deterrence structure completely outweighs the benefit that we get, especially for Americans in terms of, if we're purely looking at like a national security for, I want to keep America, as most safe, but if you want to, separate, nuclear militarism and other types of militarism, our conventional, warfare is quite strong. Our conventional strength is quite strong compared to the rest of the world, but there's sort of unnecessary risk. I tell a lot of people that sort of we put on ourselves by, with nuclear deterrence.
Yeah, I could jump in with some thoughts here. I think deterrence is the doctrine. It's really like a religious faith. If you look at the way the national security institutions address this and the way it's discussed in Washington, and the constant line is that, well, this is essential for keeping the peace. But of course, deterrence has not kept the peace. There have been many wars, the terrible war going on in Ukraine right now. And it's not a strategy that can guarantee peace, and quite the contrary. And I think, as Rishi mentioned, the incredible risk factor that our security is hanging by a thread of, depending on the infallibility of human beings. Robert McNamara used to say the combination of human infallibility and the presence of nuclear weapons means inevitable disaster. And that alone should be enough to convince people. But just to go a little bit further, even if you're accepting the basic deterrence of international security theory, you don't need a whole lot of weapons to deter another country. I mean, this is the idea there was minimum deterrence. Whatever the number is, 50, 100 weapons is certainly enough to convince Russia or anyone else who might contemplate a preemptive nuclear strike that there's a reactive force that could be a consequence. The US policy has been to match the numbers, and these treaties actually, unfortunately, reinforce that framework of thinking. And I've seen discussions lately that the US needs to match not only Russia, but also China and build up our weapons to that level. And so there's a lot of, I think, dangerous thinking that's part of that. And then the last point, I think Rishi's observation is exactly right about, conventional military posture and the overall strength of nations. Russia has displayed its weaknesses in what it's doing in Ukraine. And while people in Poland and the states in Eastern Europe are rightly very worried about they may be next, they are preparing defenses and civilian defenses and various means to protect themselves if Russia should attack. So there's a lot of ways to protect against potential aggressors without having to build thousands of nuclear weapons. And moving down in the nuclear weapons structure and less reliance on nuclear weapons could potentially open the door to more cooperative processes, because the fundamental weakness of deterrence is it's a fear and threat-based posture. And we need to be trying to move the international system toward means of cooperation and finding peacemaking strategies and conflict reduction strategies. And there are many of these, but they get obscured and they don't come into the discussion when the conversation is focused on a deterrence framework.
Thank you, David. I've seen Vincent and Tondi writing a lot of really great stuff in the chat to add to the conversation. And I wonder, Vincent, if you raise your hand, I can add you to the spotlight so you can maybe elaborate. I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't want to. I can't see you right now, but.
Yeah, no, okay. It's fine. Is there something in particular you want me to hit on, or?
Maybe elaborate what you were talking about in the chat about how this isn't working and how countries are saying we're not deterred, like the US and Russia being like their actions are not deterring us.
Yeah, I mean, deterrence is such a silly argument or a silly thing. I think it's easier than you think to kind of put a pin in it when you realize the US is running around saying we won't be deterred by anything Russia does. So if there's threats of nuclear weapons and Russia saying we won't be deterred by the United States, well, then how can you say deterrence works, right? If deterrence worked, then if Ukraine was truly deterred by Russia using nuclear weapons or threatening to use them, then they wouldn't fought back. If Palestinians were truly, deterred by Israel saying they're going to use nuclear weapons in Gaza, they wouldn't be trying to defend themselves. So the idea that deterrence working is silly, and as others have pointed out, doesn't work. I think some of the things, with the NPT is there's this, for me, if you look at the NPT, if we're looking at, say, building a house, I look at NPT as the cornerstone, right? And I look at the TPNW as the capstone. There's a lot of floors we got to build in between, right? But that should be what we're trying to get to. And right now, the sacred thing of the NPT is Article 6, and it's not working, right? We're not seeing nuclear powers in good faith try to disarm.
I'm Don Lathrop, and I just want to add something, particularly in line with Rishi's comments. Reaching people and having them know. I was 11 years old when Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, so I remember that quite well. But most people who aren't 91, as I will be next week, don't remember such things. And so we've had many students live with us. I taught at Berkshire Community College in Pittsfield for 40 years plus, and one of the people who lived with us was a Japanese woman, and she got to speaking all around as far as New York and Boston and so on. And so we went with her 10 times to Japan to find people who would volunteer and come over here and talk. And we found hosts for all of them. There was 57 volunteers came over about a 25-year period, and they talked 11,845 times to over 370,000 people. So that program came and died, after it just, we had a little harder to find people to interview because the jobs were scarce in Japan as they weren't to begin with. So anyhow, I would just say we have a brochure that explains what we did, and anybody would like a copy, you get to see ways volunteers were applied in talking in different places, what the kinds of things they said, and the kind of interviews they had in Japan before they came with survivors. And so if anybody wants, I can send it to the organizer of this group, my email, and we can send you a brochure about that, and you can maybe find a way of, we need to educate more people about the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that's what this is all about. Perhaps I've talked too long. I hope not.
Thank you for sharing that, Don. That's very important work. And yes, of course, as the Hibakusha are getting ever older with the 80th anniversary this year, there's less folks around to be able to share those kind of direct accounts. So it's very moving and powerful that you're able to do that work. And I'm sure those kind of testimonies would really help with reaching students as well. There was a question earlier about kind of the connection between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. It was a little technical, but I think the broad theme is important to address. So Diane, did you want to talk about this a little?
Well, I would just, I would begin the conversation, but I really want to hear what other people are thinking about it, because I think far too often people treat nuclear power as if it's a completely separate thing. But I think the concern that that nuclear power also provides materials that can be used in making nuclear weapons. I mean, the whole NPT, I think, was extremely flawed because it said people shouldn't develop nuclear weapons, but then it gave them the materials to do so by giving nuclear power. And now in the US, some people are promoting nuclear power when I think it's just putting nuclear weapons in making them much more available and creating materials that are dangerous in and of themselves, as well as that can be used for bombs. But I'd certainly be interested in what the other panelists think as well.
Helen Caldicott once said, maybe more than once, that every nuclear power plant is a bomb factory.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's basically true. And, Congress member now, Senator Ed Markey, always made a strong emphasis on nuclear power having this fundamental flaw, providing a pathway to nuclear weapons capacity.
Sharing. Rishi, do you want to jump in on that? Have you encountered this kind of question about nuclear power in your work with Students for Disarmament?
Yeah, we mostly try to focus ourselves as a single issue group. So there's a lot of big arguments about that, but I think as much common ground as we can find on the weapons is good to preserve that. So I'll just say that.
Great, thank you. And I saw a lot of questions in the chat about lobbying specific Congress people, especially in New York. So if you're interested in lobbying, please reach out. We're always happy to help put a delegation together. I find that, as was mentioned earlier, grassroots lobbying with constituents is very powerful, but it never hurts to bring in a few expert voices to help lend legitimacy. And I know the speakers on this call, and perhaps they or their colleagues could join us as well. So if you're interested in lobbying or want more information on how to do that, we can also send information about that after the call, but feel free to email us at info@panys.org or through many other groups, but had to give that plug while we're here. We have just about 4 minutes left before we say we would close. So I want to make sure I can give each of our panelists a moment to say some closing words and thoughts. But thank you so much, everyone, for being here, for being so insightful and respectful in the chat, and for having such a great conversation with us. So maybe in the order that we originally spoke, if folks would like to say some closing thoughts. So that means I think we're starting with you, David.
Okay. Well, thank you. This has been a great conversation. I'm impressed that a good number of people have stayed with us all the way through. So I'm encouraged that there is a commitment and interest in doing something about this issue. And there's so much activity underway, really. If you think about the collective, the sum of the total of all the different anti-nuclear disarmament-oriented groups, there's a lot. So the challenge is for us to stay in conversation and find ways in which we can work in harmony. And if we could harness the collective energy and support that we have across the country, we could begin to make a difference. So.
Great, thank you, David. And next I'll pass it to Diane.
Thank you so much. I think there was so much insightful material from the rest of the panel, and I so appreciate Emily's leadership here and Tara behind the scenes. And I want to say one thing that I didn't mention and I didn't hear, well, maybe somebody mentioned the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I would suggest that that's a way to come together nationally, whatever specific things we're working on to bring together all of these issues and bring attention, because it's a big anniversary, and I think the media will pay attention. I think our legislators will pay attention, and hopefully we can use that to unify our voices.
Thanks, Diane. Larry?
Thank you. If nuclear weapons continue in the hands of nations, it's almost inevitable that at some point they will be used in war, a war that will destroy most life on Earth. But human beings have faced the threat of nuclear annihilation before and have averted it with worldwide action. They can do so again by mobilizing an international campaign for nuclear disarmament that, as I'd mentioned, coupled with a stronger United Nations, can compel the nuclear powers to halt their race to disaster by signing the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons.
Thank you, Larry. And Rishi?
Yeah, I just want to thank all my fellow panelists again for their time and all you guys for coming. I guess my final note would be just sort of just leaving with a note of optimism, I guess, about young people. I think sort of oftentimes there's a little bit of frustration in this movement that young people, don't care, that, since we haven't lived through, any of the media coverage of this sort of issue that, we can't hear. And I just want to emphasize that that's really not true. And as I've been filled with so much hope and optimism that, we can do something about it, my generation. It's just the issues of awareness, not of capability. And I think, if we focus on really getting the message out to young communities, I think I want to highlight what Diane said before, actually, is in, at the very beginning, she talked about like manifestations of nuclear weapons and things like art and media. I was really excited at first when the Oppenheimer movie was released last year, because I thought it'd be a big sort of way to get people, thinking about nuclear weapons. And the actual content of the movie, as of course, did not really focus on the consequences of the development of the bomb, but there's still a little bit. But I can tell you I'm in touch with a producer right now who's working on a mini series. Hopefully he's pitching it to major studios about nuclear weapons, like a dramatic sort of Netflix type thing. And I think, any sort of avenues we can have to like get nuclear weapons into the media, into, get it into conversation with people, particularly about young people. I think there's a lot of capacity for change, really quickly, in fact. So thank you everyone so much for coming.
This